Thank you for joining us on tonight's conversation titled Hard Conversations in Difficult Times, Talking to Our Kids About Current Events, Racial Injustice, and Inequity. I want to say good evening again to everybody. Thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation. I want to start by introducing myself as Dr. Melody Alegria. I am the new Assistant Superintendent for Special Services here. I started on April 27th, and I am so excited to be a part of this community. I would like to start by thanking the Parenting Center for putting together this wonderful project, Karen Weiland as the director of the Parenting Center, and also Eric Stoudemire, one of our district social workers, for his assistance as well in getting this important conversation set up. I'm very thankful to work in a community that has welcomed this tough topic into their home. So thank you all again for joining us tonight. As a mother of two beautiful Black boys, I find this topic to be of extreme importance as we raise our children to navigate through life. I have found that children are never too young to learn about diversity. As parents and caregivers, we must have the confidence in ourselves and in our children that we and they can handle tough topics and tough conversations. We must understand that our role is to be honest, specific, and trustworthy as we raise the next generation to confront racial injustice. For this very sentiment, I am pleased that we have two extraordinary experts here tonight to help guide us in addressing this topic. Tonight, we have Dr. Eddie Fergus, who is an associate professor of urban education and policy at Temple University. Dr. Fergus's current work is on the intersection of educational policy and outcomes with a specific focus on Black and Latino boys, academic and social outcomes, disproportionality in special education, and suspensions in climate conditions. Dr. Fergus has been a consultant for the South Orange Maplewood School District for the past 2 years, consulting on our intentional integration initiative and working with elementary school principals on school-wide professional development to support the intentional integration process. Along with Dr. Fergus, we also have Dr. Adam Price. Dr. Price is a clinical psychologist with more than 20 years of experience working with children and teens. Dr. Adam Price is a nationally known clinical psychologist and best-selling author with over 30 years experience working with children and adults. He is the author of He's Not Lazy, Empowering Your Son to Believe in Himself, and blogs for Psychology Today. He has also written for Family Circle Magazine, Attitude Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Price maintains a private practice in New York City and in Chatham, New Jersey. Like Dr. Fergus, Dr. Price has also worked and collaborated with the South Orange and Maplewood School District. We are lucky to have two top experts in this field here tonight to provide advice and appropriate ways for us as parents and caregivers to speak to our children about racial injustice and equity. As tonight's discussion progresses, I will be monitoring questions placed into our Q&A box and will be reading them aloud for input and suggestions from both Dr. Fergus and Dr. Price. So without further ado, I would like to present tonight's experts, Dr. Fergus and Dr. Price. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining South Orange Maplewood community. I've spent so much time in the community. I'm always excited to sort of be a part of any of these sets of conversations. Obviously, I want to start first by thanking Karen for her outreach as usual. Karen is always on top of it and suggesting great ideas of how to engage our different communities in moving forward in something that I think is at the heart of sort of what I think we all consider sort of an important ethos. But it's always, one of the difficult parts is actually doing the work, is maintaining and staying strong around it. So I want to thank Karen for that. Also, the school district for wanting to sort of host this type of conversation, and a community that is so eager to engage in this. So I'm excited to join this conversation here, and as well as just getting to know Adam over the last week or so, and the work that he gets to do also throughout the country, and as well as within the South Orange Maplewood community. So we're gonna spend some energy first, sort of laying out some big ideas that I think are relevant and as well as tips that we consider are significant for as a community for us to kind of consider. I'll start first by, recognizing something that I think Karen also was very mindful of is, we want to make sure that as we're demonstrating expertise, that we're demonstrating the range of diversity of expertise that you want to have available to you, right? So Adam being a psychologist, myself being a sociologist, we bring in different sets of perspectives, not only in terms of our discipline, also obviously our sets of experiences, but also in terms of our own sort of personalized sort of stories, including our racial and ethnic identifications, which I think in the conversations Adam and I have been having over the last week have been very fruitful and enlightening and very valuable to kind of have this, what I'm going to talk about later in terms of the types of intergroup contact that is necessary for us to know how do we sort of develop forward. So so Adam and I are going to spend, 20 or so minutes kind of sharing some of those big things that we think are important for the community, particularly parents to consider as they're engaging their children. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So please, please, please participate in the Q&A, the chat room, the chat feature that's available here on this WebEx feature. We are definitely going to be paying attention to it, and we are eager to hear the types of questions and thoughts and concerns that you're contending with as a South Orange Maplewood community member, but also as a parent who's thinking about, how do you talk to your children about this? So with that, I know Adam is going to project the PowerPoint.
Hey, Adam, I think you're gonna have to hit that share button again.
Okay, hold on. Oh, I thought, okay, hold on. Are we good?
Yes, we are good. Thank you. There we go, Adam. Thank you. So first we're gonna, I'm gonna share, as a sociologist, gonna share some of the sort of big picture sort of topics that are swirling, that as a community, I think it's important for us to really expend a great deal of energy in understanding. And part of that understanding, I'm going to expend just a little bit of energy in talking about sort of some definitional pieces. And then Adam is going to talk from the vantage point of, so how do we carry this forward in talking with our kids? How do we make sure that that when we talk about sort of the idea of systemic versus individual oppression, that that's not the language that we're going to necessarily use, but we actually sort of frame it for our kids in a way that it's palatable for them to handle, and also is responsive to the different developmental sort of stages that they're at. Next slide, Adam. There we go. So, so I think some of the sort of big topics that are swirling in our community, that our kids are paying attention to, and by let me just say that these topics are not finite. These are not the completeness, but I think they're some of the most substantive ones, right? So one is the reconciling that there is this point around systemic racism and oppression. Right, the idea that that systems at times operate to preference one racial group over others, which is a big idea for our that as a society we continuously struggle with, even in defining sort of what that necessarily looks like, how it operates. But then how do we convey that to our kids in such a way that they reconcile that it's not what I would always call it's like deterministic, that it's like that it's a done deal, but rather that there are ways in which that as a society we can be mindful of how do we push back, how do we make sure that we are operating from an ethos that that we're not allowing those types of preferences to continuously take over. And I think another piece for us to sort of be mindful of as a topic is the recognizing that this movement, right, Black Lives Matter movement is a movement, right? And recognizing that it is an activist movement that follows in the tradition of previous civil rights movements, right? That also sought to highlight the types of injustices that are occurring within our society, and also the ways in which we recommend change. For those who are historians, I'm a former social studies teacher, so for me, everything is always historical. What are the ways in which we have manifested this previously, and sort of demonstrated sort of the ways in which we understand injustices? And so what we are seeing now is our most recent iteration of what it's meaning for us to highlight injustices, and also the ways in which we recommend change. As we all know, that there's a lot that's being discussed in terms of ways, different types of recommendations, different ways in which we're understanding injustices. But in order for us to kind of sort of wrap ourselves around these set of topics and feel comfortable to engage in it, there's a couple of sort of definitional or fundamental knowledge that I think is important, that we are ready and poised as adults to kind of to engage our youth in a way that they are able to kind of begin to wrap their arms around and be able to handle it in a way that's meaningful. So if we go to the next slide, so these are just some of the sort of fundamental knowledge pieces that I consider sort of important, that if we're going to talk about sort of systemic issues, if we're going to talk about civil rights movements and why that occurs, there should be sort of as adults, as we are talking with our kids, that we are attentive of particular sort of definitional ideas or fundamental knowledge that is relevant for us to kind of hold on to, right? So the first is the idea of race as a social construct with real implications. Recognizing that, race in of itself is, there's a body of research that has, particularly the last 40 years, has really centered and recognized that how we understand race is also is bound to or containing sort of a cultural milieu of ideas, right? That it's involved in shared beliefs about experiences, shared norms and values. Also recognizing that race does not contain biological distinctions. Though we use what we call in my field, we use a lot of floating signifiers to kind of signal to ourselves and each other what we categorize as sort of racial characteristics. They themselves are not necessarily indicative of sort of a biological feature, but rather what we have socially constructed as identifiers, right, of what we are utilizing to identify individuals into different racial categories. In addition, that recognizing that race has also been used within the US as a tool for separation, for violence, and for hierarchical designations, right? So though we understand that race is something that has such this amazing cultural milieu and facets to it, that it also has been used in such a way to also to place people in categories, and also as a mechanism for also doing what in social psychology is called sort of ways to do affinity bias, meaning ways in which to have a particular bias for groups that you have a closer affinity to, and race in particular, and specifically racialization of specific groups has been used as a way to create a sort of a distinction or a bias towards in our current sort of moment in which we are squarely discussing is around Blackness, right? That there's been a utilization of race to create an ongoing sort of facet of bias in a way that that has what we call sort of a fever of sort of anti-Blackness, that we're at a moment in time that I think as a society, we are waking up in particular ways and recognizing that we have to appreciate the cultural milieu that Blackness brings to the table, and not continue this habit of what may live within certain systems of separation, of violence, and of hierarchical designations. Another sort of big fundamental idea that is important for us to handle as adults is recognizing systemic systems of oppression and individual acts of oppression, right? There's a book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva titled Racism Without Racists, right? So the idea that Eduardo Bonilla Silva outlines in the book is this notion of the ways in which sort of oppressive systems operate, like racism, sexism, homophobia, that you construct them in such a way that they become part of the fabric, the cultural fabric of how our society operates, that it doesn't necessarily need individuals, but rather it's baked into the ways in which we make decisions, we create preferences, that it doesn't necessitate sort of an individual to kind of be at play. And I borrow from that idea of a way in which we recognize as adults that that systemic oppression sort of points to a way in which an organization sort of operates with very explicit and implicit preferences, right? That it doesn't require a particular individual to necessarily, to do something, a particular act or discriminate, but rather just a way in which it sort of tends to preference one group over another. And our current reality, and particularly around policing, is the recognition of how the ways in which policing as a tool has a facet in which it may preference one group over another through lenses like profiling, or identifying sort of what looks like risky behavior, right? The ways in which systemic oppression operates within something like that is that by allowing, by not giving sort of a particular definition around what it means for what looks like risky behavior, we're left to add in our own sets of implicit and explicit preferences around that. The other dynamic that we have to understand is individual acts of oppression, right? And that, as we all can imagine, it's about individuals performing particular acts of discrimination. And we hear a lot of language of there are bad apples in the world, right? And though I agree that there may be bad apples or individuals who have those particular acts, we also have to recognize that what tree is the bad apples coming from, right? What is the root, the trunk of it? And also recognizing not only sort of the bad apples are maybe existing, but what are the ways in which our larger community gives permission for the bad apples to continue existing and operating the ways in which we do. And I think our current moment, and I'm so pleased to kind of particularly seeing our youth who have become so involved, is recognizing that they're choosing to no longer give permission for that tenor of bad apple to exist. And the last piece around sort of understanding systemic oppression is particularly this element around preferencing, right? That it's it's an idea that we have to recognize that it's preferencing happens in ways that are very subtle, right? So that for groups who exist within our society as in a minoritized state or continuously marginalized, are always aware of sort of the nature to which their identity is not always at the centerpiece of preferencing. So we see that in cosmetics or the types of doll options, right? I have two kids. I have a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old, and my 16-year-old, who's my daughter, when she was in her doll stage, she wanted her American doll, and going to the American Doll store in Manhattan, I was fascinated by the ways in which preferencing was set up throughout that location, in which if any of you have ever read sort of the storylines of each doll, the stories around the Native American, the one Native American, the Mexican American, and the African American dolls are stories of struggle and strife, but yet the stories of the white dolls were always stories of being a good daughter, participating in a broader community. And so there was subtle messages that were kind of being sort of relayed to youth, to my daughter in particular, in terms of what it meant for her to preference certain dolls, that if she's going to preference the Native American doll, the Mexican American doll, that their entire story, their one narrative or their one story is all about struggle. Or even the ways in which reality shows occur, right? The last couple of days, there's been sort of such great fanfare around the Bachelor show, which I have to say, I do not necessarily watch, but I'm aware of, right? That they finally have their first Black male bachelor. And sort of we're supposed to rah, which I'm going to applaud the effort, but I'm also going to be cognizant of recognizing that it took 18 years, right, for a reality show like The Bachelor to sort of designate this particular facet of preference to the U.S. society. And so as we think about sort of systemic oppression, is that we have to really understand sort of the nature of the system, the organizations it's in, but also this idea of preference, how that preferencing piece exists within and permeates throughout our lived reality. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam, who's going to, spend some time kind of talking through us around, well, how do we talk to our kids about this stuff? So we can absorb this information as adults, but how do we begin sort of relaying this stuff to our own kids?
Dr. Fergus, just a question or a comment, excuse me. It says race as social construct is made evident to me the way U.S. opinions have changed around different immigrant demographic groups. For example, Italians considered non-white or people of color in the past few decades to today now considered white. So that's just a comment thrown out in the Q&A box if anyone would like to share anything on that.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And there's a great book titled How Italians Became White. And, and it's amazing sort of storyline of how, not only sort of how that trajectory has happened, right? And Omi and Winant, who are two research sociologists, wrote a great book called Racial Formation in the U.S. And they talk about what they call the racialization project that the U.S. has been taking on for decades. And they really spend some good time in that book outlining how the story of various groups are part of the racial formation project. And you're right. So how Italians have become white over time, how Irish have become white over time, and how that coincides with the trajectory of African Americans or Latinx populations who have not had an opportunity, who have not had a similar trajectory in terms of how they've sort of their ethnic identity has changed over time. And that has to do with the racialization project that the US is in particular doing. And part of that comes back to sort of the way in which we imagine preferencing.
Thank you. The last comment is just if we could collect the titles of some of the books that you guys are recommending, and we can definitely work on that. Thank you. Dr. Price.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I would like to stop. I'm not going to use my slides, so I'd like to stop the screen sharing. How's that? That's good?
Got it. Yep.
Okay, great. First of all, I am really honored, and it's a privilege to be here to be not just presenting with Dr. Fergus, but also learning so much from him. And I really have enjoyed the conversations we've had over the past few weeks. And of course, or the past week, kudos to Karen Weiland, who has led the Parenting Center through so many difficult times and difficult issues, and has been such a valuable resource to our community. I appreciate all of the credentials about myself that were presented, but the one I'm most proud of is that I'm a resident of Maplewood. I've lived here for 28 years and had two kids through the school system. I wanted to start just giving you a little context about me. I work with a lot of transgender and non-conforming youth, and we talk with them about their gender journey. So I just wanted to talk very quickly about I guess I would call it my racial journey. It doesn't sound as catchy as gender journey. But it's really been a story for me of learning over and over again how much I thought I understood about the African American experience in this country and how I really didn't understand it. So it's been a journey for me in humility. And including learning new things just in talking with Dr. Fergus, who's written about color blindness and about how color blindness is a white privilege to be able to be colorblind, and it's something that to not see someone's race is really to take away understanding who they are and an important part of their identity. So I'm not talking about that, but I really am aware of my own bias blindness. And to illustrate that, I grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is kind of the Maplewood of the Midwest. It was a integrated community back in the 60s. I think it was 40% Black, 60% white. Quite progressive in trying to integrate the schools, in trying to end redlining in the community. And actually, Maplewood has used, South Orange Maplewood has been, we've had administrators from Shaker and a lot of consulting and thoughts going back and forth. So I grew up in that environment. One of the first things I remember, and probably the most painful, is, well, the first thing I remember is going to first grade and my mother saying, you have to listen to everything that the teacher says, but in our class, you can do whatever you want. So we had to do a portrait, and I wanted to draw myself in purple. And the teacher said, oh, no, you have to use the peach color, which isn't really the color of my skin. And I came home and I told my mom, who was quite astounded. And then I said, Mom, what about the Black kids in my class? What color are they supposed to use? Do they have to use peach? But then fast forward to when I was, and we called it junior high school up to 9th grade. My best friends in 9th grade were a boy named Richard Mulroy, who had the blondest hair I've ever seen, and a boy named Edmund Pace, who had a very large afro, which was very fashionable at the time. And so we were good friends. We hung out together all the time. Summer came, we went our separate ways, and then we both entered high school. And I remember being in high school and being in the gym and seeing Edmund, and we'd all gone through puberty, and he got a lot taller than I did, but I kind of recognized him, I kind of didn't. He looked at me, I looked at him, and there was this moment of recognition, but not, there's also this moment where we weren't going to say hello to each other. And it was a lot of teenage self-consciousness, and it was also some sort of interpretation of a line that we just didn't know if it was okay to cross. And even though there were kids had Black and white friends, but I remember that with such regret, and having lost that good friend. But since then, I've worked in urban hospitals. My wife and I moved to Maplewood because of the racial diversity here, and we thought that was enough in terms of our awareness and understanding. I've learned so much. I learned so much from my kids' friends. My younger daughter had a group of very integrated friends. I was in shock when they would come over and talk to me, because we talk a lot with them and talk a lot about race, about what their parents told them, how their parents tried, protected them, told them how to act with the police, things I'll get into in a minute. But it's just been a journey for me. So that's part of my privilege and my honor of being here. So I'm going to talk to all parents in the audience about how to talk to kids about difficult topics such as what's been happening in the news and race. I have some thoughts for white parents about how to talk to their kids about race and racism, but it's not my place to talk to Black parents about what to say to their kids. So the first thing that I want to talk about in talking about difficult topics is some guiding principles. So the first one is to be direct. Don't be afraid to address things head on. It's really important with kids to speak in simple terms that they can understand. And in a minute, I'm going to break it down into age groups. But addressing the tough stuff is what really helps our kids to feel safe. And so many times we want to avoid these subjects, these topics, because we feel like we're going to be protecting them when really we're doing them a disservice. So my first advice is to be direct. But my second piece of advice is to be human. Kids do not need us to know everything, and they don't expect us to be perfect. In fact, what they really want are parents who can show them how to deal with life's uncertainty and with our own imperfections and theirs. In the words of my friend and colleague Rosalind Weissman, who wrote the book Mean Girls, kids profoundly want strong, comforting, honorable adults who admit how messy life is. Kids profoundly want, again, strong, comforting, honorable adults who admit how messy life is. So in being human, it's really important because kids pick up on our energy. So it's important to wait till you've had time to digest and process what's going on so that when you talk to your kids, you can remain calm. And with today's environment and news, it's really hard to digest it. It's been happening so fast, but I think that that's important. It's okay to share your feelings, but it's equally important to be in control when you do. So be direct, be human, be reassuring. Even if what's happening makes you afraid or makes you sad, make sure that your kids know you'll do everything that you can to keep them safe. No matter what happens, tell them that you'll be them just as you already have been. Mr. Rogers, this is ironic, Mr. Rogers had a line that I would quote, which was, when bad things are happening, look at all the people around you that are helping, which I think is still bears weight. But of course, some of those people are the police, and they're not always so helpful, as we know. I think they can be very destructive. So it's still important, though, to be hopeful with kids. Don't dismiss or ignore a child's feelings when talking about anything, really, but especially about difficult subjects. Avoid trying to cheer them up or say it's not so bad. An adult father I work with this week told me that he missed a great opportunity because his daughter was about to go and move into her apartment as a sophomore in college, and she said to him, I'm afraid. And he said, oh, don't worry, you're going to be fine. And he realized that he missed the opportunity to really allow her to talk about her feelings and share with them so that he could be more supportive. So it's really important not to dismiss a kid's feelings. It actually does more harm than good to do that. It also does more harm than good when we avoid difficult topics. Not addressing them gives the kid the message that it's not okay to discuss a topic that's too scary, that it's taboo. And there are many topics that come to mind, but it's especially important when it comes to race. Because one thing I've learned is that it's a privilege not to have to talk about race. Black families don't have that privilege. One of the, what I learned from my daughter's friend Sam is, the messages that they got from their parents I talked about at the beginning. Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put a hoodie on. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if you just bought a candy bar. If a cop stops you, in the car, don't talk back. Put your hands on the dashboard. Black families don't have the privilege of not talking about race. And kids are not colorblind. So it's really important for parents, for us not to be color silent. In fact, not talking about race teaches apathy. And talking about it teaches empathy. And this is what we want to help our kids to develop. We want them, obviously, our white kids to be able to stick up for their Black friends, to shut down racist talk when they hear it from their friends. So if we want them to talk about these things in the playground, we have to be able to talk about it at home. So I'm going to switch now to talking about the developmental stages and how to address different topics at different stages, to use it as a guide, because kids absorb different information based upon how old they are. So first, ages 2 to 6. Toddlers and first graders, they have a limited experience of life, so they don't really have a context to put things into. And you're the center of their world. They see everything through your eyes. So they're very sensitive to your emotional state. And as I said before, that's why it's important to be calm and collected when you talk about the tough topics. They don't have concrete thinking skills, so they don't really understand concepts like cause and effect. So here's an example of something you can say to your kids about race at this age in order to talk clearly to them about color differences and the reasons behind them. You can tell them how dark your skin is depends on something called melanin, and everybody has melanin, and the kids who have the most of it are Black. And here's another way to talk about racism, or a way to talk about racism. Sometimes people are treated differently because of how they look. It's pretty ridiculous because there are many ways people look different, which makes the world so interesting. Different colored hair, different texture of hair. But some people treat people with brown or Black skin badly, and they don't even know them. Ages 7 through 12. This age group, kids are starting to gain abstract reasoning skills. They're starting to have more real world experiences. They're better able to express themselves. And so they're better able to grapple with some difficult subjects and understand different perspectives. They also have greater access through media greater access to information through media, through reading, through their peers, if you ever get to see them again. So they may be coming home with information that you didn't necessarily know they had. The younger kids in this age range are still shaky about the difference between what's real and what's pretend. But the older kids in this, the 12-year-olds, the tweens are beginning to separate. They're entering puberty, and so they're really interacting with the media much more independently. So when talking to them about difficult subjects, which is different than talking to them about race, because again, my advice is that we should have all been having these conversations from the time they were even younger. But in talking about difficult subjects, what's happening in the news, what they hear about, wait for the right moment. It's still very likely that they're going to come to you if they've heard something that's frightening. Feel them out to decide if it's something that they want to discuss. But if they don't, you don't have to bring it up. You don't have to broach the difficult subject until they ask about it. Now, you may want to talk about some things that are happening in the news. You may want to inform them, and that's okay. You